I'm here today with Jim Campbell, who is the youngest son of Carlos Campbell, one of the gentlemen that was very instrumental in the formation of the Smoky Mountain National Park. Jim, thanks for being with us today.
Very glad to be here, Mike.
Tell me a little bit about your family and about your background.
Well, we were all born in Knoxville. My dad actually was born, for whom this Overlook is named, was born in Sevier County. Came to, matter of fact, at the interchange of I-40 and Highway 66 going to Sevierville and the park. I thought that was interesting that he was born on a farm at that very location.
Tell me what it was like growing up with your parents and your dad especially.
Well, Dad was gone a lot. He was up here in the mountains. I was born in 1928, and he got interested in the Smokies in about 1923 or 4. And he was up here nearly every weekend, summer and winter, hiking and whatever, and became interested in getting it made into a national park.
How did your dad get really interested in the formation of the park or making this into a national park?
Well, he was first a newspaper man in Knoxville when he was young, and then he became assistant manager and later manager of the Knoxville Chamber of Commerce. And a number of his friends tried to get him interested in coming up here, but he said he was too busy, and one of them was a local architect, Charlie Barber, who designed a lot of University of Tennessee buildings, a lot of churches around Knoxville. He said, if I were inviting you to Yellowstone, you'd go, but here you won't go to the Smokies. So Dad went, they hiked to LeConte, Dad was hooked, and he never looked back till he died at age 86 in 1978. And at first, he was annoyed by all the people talking up the park, and trying to make it a national park. But then when he got hooked, he got over that. And as a matter of fact, he worked so hard doing that he was asked to resign because they didn't think he was spending enough time bringing in business.
What was the name of the group that actually was involved with starting the park?
Well, there were several groups. It later became, about 1920, late 23 or 4, the Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association. The idea was originated by Mrs. Willis Davis. Her husband was the owner of Knoxville Iron Company, and they visited some western parks, and she got back and she said, "This was wonderful, Willis, but says what we have here is even better, or at least as good. We should have a national park here." So he was on the Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors, and he was one of those who talked it up to Dad.
And that was a lot of Knoxville people and people?
A lot of Knoxville people and a lot of North Carolina people.
Mm-hmm.
There were a number of them. Colonel Chapman, General Frank Maloney, Ben Morton, who was mayor of Knoxville and one of the wealthiest businessmen in Knoxville, if not the most. Russell Hanlon, who was interested in the Automobile Club. Paul Fink from Jonesboro. Ed Neiman, the editor of the Knoxville News Sentinel. The Governor Austin Peay. A number of governors were instrumental in it. And from North Carolina, Senator Mark Squire, state senator, mm-hmm. Charles Webb, George McCoy, editor of the Asheville Citizen-Times, Plato Ebbs, a number of people. There are just too many to name them all.
And they all had a burning desire and a passion.
They all did, and really all worked hard over about a 10-year period to achieve this.
Jim, what were some of the biggest obstacles that they had to cross to make this happen?
There were a lot of them. First interest of a lot of people was in getting a road across the mountain. There was no road from the French Broad River. That's way east of where Interstate 40 crosses the mountains, all the way to the Georgia border. So they viewed the mountains, most people, businessmen in Asheville and Knoxville and East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, viewed it as an obstacle. So they wanted a road across and viewed the mountains as an obstacle. Mm-hmm. And later on, a lot of them were more interested in becoming a national park. But some of them were still fighting for the road, and they didn't want the road quite yet because that would make the cost of the land go up. So it was sort of a catch-22 in that situation there. There were about 6,000 landholders here, a lot of them on a giveaway of 25-foot lots, but say really about 1,200 significant landholders. 18 lumber companies, 2 of which had significant holdings, Little River Lumber Company in Tennessee and Champion Fiber in both North Carolina and Tennessee, along the state line between about Clemens Dome and Mount Geo.
I bet that was hard to get them out of the park.
Oh, it really was, and that was one of the main obstacles, raising the money, which they had to do with the state legislature. They ended up getting some money from the federal government, and they raised money even among school children. They had drives where school children, just to get a lot of people on board, they would give something like 50 cents or 25 cents. And you have to remember that a lot of this was during the Depression. After the Black Monday or Friday, whichever it was, in 1929, a lot of this money was raised after that.
Now the Rockefellers obviously donated a tremendous amount of money.
$5 million. John D. Rockefeller Jr. Donated in memory of his mother, Laura Spelman Rockefeller, and there's a memorial at Newfound Gap to her memory.
What was a lot of that money used for? Was it for land purchase?
It was about all of it was for land purchases, and it was about a total of $12 million is what was given, both by federal, local, state governments, cities of Knoxville and Asheville, school children, and the Rockefeller donation. And that, like I say, that's today that's chicken feed, but then that was a significant sum.
A lot of money.
And it took a lot of trouble to get. There were other obstacles. Some groups wanted to make it a national forest, which would allow timber cutting, continued timber cutting. Only about 1/3 of the park was still virgin territory, but it would have all been gone if they had continued lumbering. They would have replanted, but that was one of the obstacles. Also, the North Carolina group wanted Grandfather Mountain and Linville Gorge area to be a national park instead of this. Finally, all these people who were interested in it convinced the National Park Service that this was the best place to have a national park rather than that. So that took away some of the obstacles. A lot of politics and the individual landowners, those were all obstacles.
And then eminent domain condemnation, that had to come into part.
It did. That's a rather ugly proposition, but it's necessary to have roads, dams, schools, whatever. And it created a lot of bitterness, which was very unfortunate, but some of that had to be resorted to.
And touch on a little bit about the CCC also.
Well, the CCC, I don't remember the exact year it started, but I remember as a little boy going to a lot of these camps. There were 16 in the park at the peak in about 34 and 35, and there were, I think at the peak there were about 4,000 CCC boys. Some of them were boys, some of them were men, which was one of the New Deal programs that FDR instituted. And they built most of the roads, the finalization of the roads, the trails, the bridges for cars and for hikers, and did a magnificent job.
And is that when the park, when the road went across the park at that time?
Well, there was a primitive road just in the late 20s.
Yeah, you hear about the old road that's down
below. But it was
below
really
there.
primitive, and I can remember it, not the earliest part, but there were a lot of switchbacks, and it was a real adventure. What with the condition of the automobiles at that time and the condition of the roads, it was a real journey.
You know, we talked the other day on the phone a little bit, and you mentioned about the number of different trees here compared to all of Europe.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there have been counted at least 130 different species of trees here, whereas the whole continent of Europe has 150. That's really amazing. As a matter of fact, the flora here in the park, there's probably, well, I think it's a proven fact that, if I'm not mistaken, that there is no other comparable area in the whole United States or Canada that has the diversity of trees, shrubs, plants than right here in this limited area. There's 500,000 acres.
Jim, where are we now? Tell us where we're located right now.
Well, as the sign says, of course, we're at Campbell Overlook, and we're looking at the west end of Mount LeConte. The peak on the left is Bullhead, and it's 4,300 feet above sea level, and the peak in the clouds there is Balsam Point, which is 5,800 feet, and we're about 2,400 feet here.
Tell me about the story when you were kidding your dad about they were going to name an overlook in the park after him.
Well, before that, about 10 years before he died, I said, Dad, do you think they'll ever name a peak or an overlook in the park after you? And he said, oh, why no, why would they? I said, well, maybe they would. And he said, well, all the peaks are named, and certainly wouldn't want to rename one. I finally pinned him down to one overlook, the Big Walnut Overlook, and I started calling it jokingly to him as Campbell Overlook from that point on. My wife and I are bird watchers, and we often would lead bird trips up here. By the way, my binoculars are right down here. If my wife spots a peregrine falcon, I'm going to stop this interview and look at it, I guarantee you. It's my favorite bird. But anyway, I would say that, well, Dad, we had a bird trip here, and we stopped at Campbell Overlook, and we saw such and such a bird, or heard such and such a bird, and he'd say, get out of here. So lo and behold, when he died in '78, 3 years later, they named it Carlos Campbell Overlook. So it did happen.
Now, when the park was formed, there were certain stipulations that were put in, and your dad had a lot to do with that. Tell me about some of those stipulations.
There were those who wanted to have Cades Cove revert to wilderness. He and the Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association thought, and a lot of other people did, that it would be better to maintain it as a historical area, which is really what it is, within the park. And that opinion prevailed, and that's the way it is today. And it's one of the most enjoyed and visited parts of the park. And nearly all the rest of the park is heavily wooded, and it's a welcome change. As beautiful as this gives a little diversity to the park. As to the grass balls, there's some controversy. There are several of them along the state line between Klingman's Dome and the western end of the park. Some controversy as to how what happened, but they were at least kept going for a while by some of the farmers in Cades Cove and in North Carolina would drive herds of sheep and cattle up there to graze. Since then, Dad and some other people have lobbied with the Park Service to clear off those balls, to maintain that as a historical area, plus Gregory Ball, one of the main ones. It has the most magnificent display of flame azalea each June, end of each June, any place in the world. It's just magnificent. And if they let that revert to forest, that would be gone.
You'd lose that.
Yeah.
And how about next to the river?
On the road from the Townsend Y to the Visitor Center along Little River Gorge, a beautiful gorge. And originally the vegetation was cleared away when they built the road, and people enjoyed seeing the stream. And he had a visitor from National Geographic. He helped write an article about the Smokies in 1936 and furnished some pictures for it. And they went back bragging about how beautiful this road was. Well, they sent somebody down here a few years later, and the vegetation had grown up to where you couldn't even see the river. So Dad said, well, let me see what I can do about that. And he thought about it, and he says, how about you sending on National Geographic letterhead and express that sentiment you just did to me? So they sent that to the director of the National Park Service in Washington, and also the superintendent of the Smokies here, and before long that was cleared, and it's been that way ever since. And I think it really helped to everybody to enjoy that vista of the gorge.
Oh, it does, because that's one of the more beautiful drives in the park, right next to the river and everything.
It sure is.
Now, there were a lot of naturalists at this time. Some of them wanted to just go back to a forest, and some even wanted to do a chairlift from downtown to LeConte.
A lot of people wanted to do things like that, and who's to say that one viewpoint is wrong and one is right? There are those on one extreme, like in the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society, who wanted to let it completely revert to nature. There are those who want to put a lodge at other places and do any number of things, but this chairlift was just one that Dad and a lot of other people fought, and that never materialized. But you know, the Park Service, in his opinion and in mine, was not just to let things revert to complete wilderness. It was to do that, certainly, to a degree, but also leave enough places, roads and trails, to where people could see them. And in order to do that, a lot of people think, well, where do you stop? And that's where this fine line appears. And it's hard to come to a conclusion on that.
Tell me about some of the awards that your dad received.
Well, I think this one right here is one of the most significant ones. Another one was the Horace Albright Award. He was one of the directors of the National Park Service, the second one, and it was very instrumental in getting this made into a national park. But it's called the Scenic Preservation Award, and I think the significance of this award is in who else has won it. Dad was the only one who wasn't nationally famous or very wealthy. Lawrence Rockefeller won it one year, Lady Bird Johnson won it the year after Dad did, and Stuart Udall, Secretary of the Interior, won it the year before. So it was in pretty good company on that award. He also was named an honorary park ranger of the Park Service, and when he was the 21st one awarded in the whole country, and the first Tennessean. Your own Bill Mills, former mayor of Gatlinburg, which I know you're also a former mayor of Gatlinburg, was the second Tennessean so honored.
Tell me a little bit about the books that your dad has written, and also the wildflower books that was done with Dr. Sharp and Dr. Hudson.
Well, he has written three. You want me to show them now?
Please.
Okay. The first one he wrote was the first book of this type written. It's called Birth of a National Park in the Great Smoky Mountains. And it details just exactly how the idea formed and all the obstacles overcame, not all, but a number of the people involved. And you read this book and you just, even though it's like my wife, Betty Reed Campbell, sitting here right now, when I watch I'm a World War II buff, and when I watch a World War II thing, she says, Jim, why are you watching that? You know how that came out. The same thing with this book. You knew how it came out, but in reading it, you didn't think it was ever going to happen because of the many obstacles they had to overcome. So that was the first one. University of Tennessee Press did it. And the second one he did, this is the 5th edition. It's called Great Smoky Mountains Wildflowers. Dad got this idea to do this book, and Bill Hudson was going to, and did, furnish most of the photographs, and Dad did the writing of it. But Dad, being an amateur, wanted to be sure that he was botanically correct. So he got Dr. Jack Sharp at UT, who was head of the botany department and an internationally renowned botanist, to review it to be sure he hadn't made any errors. And he did make a few corrections and additions and contributed greatly to it. Then the third book that Dad wrote was called Memories of Old Smoky, perhaps his best book, at least the most interesting one, and he details in here how it was before it was a park, right after the park was established, and just a lot of little vignettes in here on a variety of subjects. You read this thing, you can't even put it down.
And all those books can be purchased at the visitor centers?
Yes, they can, in numerous bookstores in the area.
Jim, you had mentioned William Jennings Bryan. Tell me about that.
Well, when they were trying to get publicity to get people around the country in this area interested in the park, they would try to bring in as many famous people to see the park, it wasn't a park, then see the area, and to write about it for magazines or just talk about it in whatever method they could. And they were having the Scopes Monkey Trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, and it was an internationally famous trial. And when it was over, Dad contacted William Jennings Bryan and tried to get him to come up here, and he agreed to do it, although he was feeling very poorly. But Dad explained, well, you can rest up here. They had a cabin all set for him. And it was their hope, Dad's and the Conservation Association's hope, that he would love it and would help publicize it. But about an hour after Dad had his conversation with him, he got a phone call from a newspaperman, that William Jennings Bryan had died there in Dayton before he could get up here. So perhaps Dad was the very last person to have talked to him other than his wife.
You had something in this book that you wanted to read for us.
Yes. When the park was a fact, was a completion, someone asked Colonel Chapman if you could have known in advance what the problems and obstacles were to have been, what would you have charged as a fee to handle the job? There isn't that much money, was his emphatic reply, and doubtless a very true answer. But, he added, after I'd gotten into the fight, I doubt if anything short of death or total disability could have caused me to quit. Then Dad goes on to say, now that the struggle is over, we can see that the large number of challenges that the park leaders had to meet actually tend to add luster to their achievement and make it much more noteworthy. The fact that they had to solve so many annoying problems made the ultimate goal a bit sweeter and more highly prized. The obstacles are like the thorns in the completed park, like a beautiful rose.
That's beautiful. That's great. Jim, I know that you've traveled extensively throughout the country, and where is, in your opinion, the best place to be?
Well, Betty Reed and I have been in, I'd say, 3/4 of the national parks in this country, and at least that many of the national parks in Canada. We have not been to we've been to Alaska, but not to any of their national parks. I have not been to Hawaii, but they're all beautiful. They're all very different in their own individual, unique ways. But every time we come back from one or several of them, we say, what's any better than this? It's home, and it's just as pretty, and it's unique in individual ways. So we're always happy to be right here.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for sharing this with us, and we know that Gatlinburg would be absolutely nothing without the national park, and we want to thank you for just sharing these memories, and that your dad went through the fight and did what it took to join together with these men.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much, Mike. I do want to say one other thing. I want to say how much respect Dad had, and I have, for all these mountain people who were displaced up here, and what great people they are. And as a little boy, I got to know a lot of them before they were moved out, and known a lot of them since, and there are no better people on the face of the earth than these people right around here.
I agree. Jim, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.